Hey guys, welcome to another video. So in this one I'm going to be going over methods, how to pass arguments to a method, method parameters, and the syntax for method definition. So let's go ahead and create a new class, call this one method basics, and this is going to be using the public static void main string array args again. Let's open that up, except this time let's create another method. So first, actually, let's say that I want a method to just add two integers together, right, and return what the sum of those two integers are. So inside my main method here, let's just say int x is equal to 1, and then we'll say I'm going to indent that just because it's good, and then we're going to say int y is equal to 5. Okay. Now what we're going to do is we want to pass these into a method, right, and get the sum. So what we're going to do is let's create the method real quick. Now there's two different things we could do here. We could say public, or we could say private. Because the first thing we do in our method definition is we determine the accessibility of that method. Do we want it to be private, meaning the only place it can be called is from this class, or do we want it to be public, meaning we can call that method from any class outside of this one or this one. So for this, we're going to keep it pretty simple here until we get into objects and just say public, right? So we're going to say public, so we can call this method from anywhere, and we're going to say we have an option here. We could say static, or we could leave out static. Now, the static, like I talked about before, that means that that when you have a static member, it means that it exists right now, right then. It means that we don't have to create a new instance of the class in order for that static member to exist. The memory is allocated for it, it's there. So we're not going to be using method basics as an instantiable object, so let's just stick with static, because we're not using it, like I just said, we're not using it as an instantiable object. We're going to just be calling it without creating instances of it. So let's use static so that it exists. And then this is where we determine the return type. We could say void, and what that would mean is we don't have a return. This method isn't going to return anything. We call the method, it does something, but it's not actually going to return anything. What we could also do is we could put any data type here. We could say string, and that would mean that this method's going to return a string. We could say boolean, meaning this is going to return a boolean value. But we know that this method's designed to take in two integers, and it's going to return us an integer. So this is where we say public static int, because the return type is going to be an integer. And then we'll call this add two numbers. And then we open up the parentheses, and this is where we put our method parameters. Now I can't just say number1 comma number2, because I have to tell the compiler, I have to tell this method basically what type of parameter, what data type that parameter is going to be. You have to explicitly say that as well, not just when you're creating the variables, but inside of the method parameters, you have to set it to where you tell it what the parameters are, what type of data type that parameter is. So we know that we're going to take in an integer 1 and an integer 2, so that's when we say int number1 and int number2. And what that's doing is it's saying, hey, I'm going to be receiving an integer data type, and I'm going to call it number2. I'm going to be receiving an integer data type, and I'm going to call it number1. Now in Python, they have these really cool things called named arguments, and I forget the name of it, but where you have an argument and then the star, k args or whatever, meaning you can plug in an infinite number of arguments, and it's there. We can't do that in Java. There's no named arguments, and there's no sequential argument things. So every time you access a method parameter, it's by location, it's by index, it's by position. They're positional arguments. So like I just said, we have to declare explicitly say what type of argument this is, or what type of parameter this is, what data type it has to accept, and then we open up the method, and everything that happens again between this curly brace and this curly brace is going to happen within the realm, or it's encapsulated in this method. So any integers, any variables I declare here, these two variables right here, those all exist within the realm of this method and this method only, if they're declared in this method, or method parameters, which is the same thing. So I know I'm going to take in number 1 and number 2, and so I'm going to create another int variable and call it total, or sum, rather, and we're going to set it equal to whatever integer I get passed here, and we're calling that argument whatever is given to it, because the parameter is the name of an argument that a method accepts. So we're going to get, so when we call this method, we're going to pass it two arguments, and they're going to be integers, and we're calling those arguments number 1 and number 2. So the number 1 holds the value of whatever argument was passed to it, whatever integer we gave in position 1, and whatever position we gave here is number 2. So the sum is going to be number 1 plus number 2. Okay. Now I'm already getting an error, and I'm getting an error because I'm missing a return statement. We said over here that we're going to return an integer in this method. So in order for this to compile, I have to have a return statement. I have to say return, and then we're going to return the sum. And it's highlighting here because there's a better way to do this. Rather than creating another integer here and using more memory and wasting time, what we could do is just say return number 1 plus number 2. What that's going to do is it's just going to totally circumvent the need to create a new variable for that, because we could just say we're returning number 1 and number 2. But for the sake of explicitity, we're going to say sum equals number 1. Is explicitity a word? Number 1 plus number 2. And then we're going to return sum. So that's that. So when we call it, we say we're going to say integer sum is equal to, and then we say add 2 numbers. And see, IntelliJ already knows that it's going to show us the 2 parameters, named and everything. I'm pointing at my screen as if you can see my fingers right now. So number 1 and number 2. So it's just saying, you know, we have to take this int and we have to give it an int. So in order to call this correctly, because I'm getting an error because I don't pass any arguments in there, it says, hey, you need to pass in 2 ints. So that's where I pass in x and y. And then I could system.out.println, and I could print sum. So if I run that, what I'm going to get is the sum of 1 plus 6, or excuse me, 1 plus 5, which is 6, right? Because I'm passing in 1 and 5, and the method add 2 numbers takes in 2 numbers and returns the sum of them. Well, returns the sum of them, right? So that's the quick introduction to that. Cool. So if I were to try to pass in, if I have another variable here, we're going to call this one string name. We're going to say is equal to frickin' Josiah, right? If I try passing in that here, can you guess what's going to happen? It's going to throw an error because it's the wrong second argument. It found a string and it's saying it requires an int. So it protects us from trying to pass in invalid data or illegal data with respect to what we determine as legal for that data. So x, y, we're going to pass in those 2 variables. Sum is equal to that. So that's how we do that. We're getting a highlight here because I could have private access. We're not going to talk about that really. If I were to say public static and I were to say string, I'm going to get an error here because I want to get a couple errors. One, because I'm trying to return an integer, but I've said here that the return type of this method is going to be a string. And I'm getting an error here because the return type of this method, it's returning a string, right? It's supposed to return a string, and the compiler knows that because we explicitly said that in the method definition. So when we try to call it and say an int is equal to this, the return is supposed to be a string, so it's going to throw the error because we're trying to set an integer sum is equal to a string, and that's illegal. So this would have to be an int in order for this to be a legal statement. If I were to make this void and say it doesn't have a return type, and then try to return something, I would get an error as well because it's void. I'm telling the compiler, hey, I'm creating this method here. It's of the type void, which means I'm not going to have a return type or a return. So when you try to put one, some bad things happen, right? So yeah, that's your quick little thing and methods here. What I can do is I should probably talk about real quick. Let me fix this so that this is legal. Let's say I wanted to have public static int add 2 numbers, and I say int x and int y. I'm going to get an error because I've defined this method twice. Now here's the catch. let's say add two numbers. Let's say I wanted it to be, let's say I wanted to add two numbers. I can't think of a good way to word that, so I won't do it. I don't want to confuse you guys. Basically, what I'm trying to get at is if this wasn't add two numbers, if this was a method called do something, right? Let's do it this way. Do something. And I'm just taking, and this is very vague, I don't know what that do something is, unless I read the code and I can determine it. And then I have another public static int here, and I say do something. And I say, int x, and then I say string y. This is actually legal. And I know I'm getting an error here, so let me just return some int so that it's legal, just to show you for the sake of argument. This is legal. Even though the method names are the same, they're not the same method, because we can input two different things here. We can input an x and a string, whereas this method takes in two integers. Or rather, we input an integer and a string, and this method takes in two integers. So they're actually different. I'd go as far as to say that's a form of something called polymorphism, and that's one of the four pillars of object orientation. And I will get into that and explain why I'm saying that when I get into objects, because with objects you have constructors, and with constructors you could have multiple constructors that take in different arguments, and that determines how the object behaves based on those what constructor you use to construct your object. And that means it can take on different behaviors, many different behaviors, and polymorphism basically. So I go into that more when I get into objects. But so basically, this is how you use methods. If I were to try to, I'll get into that more once I get into objects, taking away static, because if I try calling do something here without that being static, I'm going to get an error, and it's going to say non-static variable cannot be referenced from static context. That's because this actually, even though it's declared, long story short, even though this is declared, and I have all the functionality of it, and this is, it's a completely legal method definition and declaration, it doesn't exist because we haven't created an instance of it. We haven't created an instance of this class to make this method exist. So it exists with respect to it's coded there, but it doesn't exist in the realm of it's created. Static means we created basically at compile time. So in the next set of videos, I'll get into that a little bit. I really want to get into actual objects and stuff like that, because that's when it gets really cool, and that's when I think you guys can really appreciate object orientation. But I'm just trying to get some of the basics out of the way, and to do that I have to show you guys how to pass arguments, which you should already know how to pass arguments into a method or a function, because again, we're coming at this as if you've taken a Python class. But I'm just showing you the syntax of how to do that in Java, and how to create another method in Java. So that's how you do that. So yeah, stay tuned for the next video. Once again, as always, thank you guys for coming.